Activated charcoal and biochar are the two materials doing all the real work. Inside every DIY water filter and every commercial filtration system. The bottled water industry sells you for $40 a cartridge. And I want to show you how to make both of them yourself for less than the cost of a single bottle of name brand spring water. Pull up a chair. I've been filtering my own water through charcoal for going on 30 years now, since before anybody in my township had ever heard the words reverse osmosis or seen a plastic pitcher with a blue cartridge sitting in a refrigerator door. My grandfather did it with a clay crock and burnt fence posts, the same way his father did it before him, and the way it was done in farmhouses across this country before anyone thought to put a brand name on a piece of charred wood. I do it with a few buckets and the same black rock he used, and I want to walk you through exactly why it works, because the bottled water industry has spent considerable money making sure you never ask that question. Here's the question they don't want asked. If charcoal filtration is good enough that they put it inside every single filtration pitcher, every refrigerator filter, every undersink system they sell you, why are they also selling you water in plastic bottles at the same time? Water that costs them a fraction of a cent and sells for $2? The answer is that the moment you understand how charcoal actually purifies water, you stop needing either the pitcher or the bottle. You stop being a customer and you start being somebody who just knows how to do this. So let's talk about what's actually happening inside that black rock. Most people say charcoal absorbs the bad stuff out of water. That's not quite right, and the difference matters more than you'd think. Charcoal works through a process called adsorption, with a D, not a B, which means contaminants stick to the surface of the charcoal rather than soaking into it like a sponge soaks up a spill. Picture a piece of flypaper instead of a paper towel. The bad stuff doesn't get absorbed into the material. It gets trapped on the surface and held there, the same way dust settles onto a windowsill and stays. Now here's why that matters for what you're about to build. Ordinary hardwood charcoal, the kind my grandfather burned in a covered pit, the kind you might have sitting in a bag in your garage right now for the grill, has a certain amount of surface area where this adsorption can happen. It works, and it's been working for the Amish and for plenty of other rural families going back centuries. But activated charcoal is hardwood charcoal that's been processed further, usually with steam or a chemical activation step, to blast millions of microscopic pores into its surface. A single gram of activated charcoal can have a surface area of 500 to 1,500 square meters, what scientists and manufacturers measure using what's called the BET surface area method. That's a piece of charcoal you could hold in your palm with roughly the same surface area as several basketball courts. Once you account for every pore, that's the entire secret. More surface area means more places for contaminants to stick. That's the whole business model, dressed up in plastic and sold back to you at a markup most people never stop to question. Now, I want to be specific here, because vague promises are how people end up trusting a method for the wrong reasons, and Uncle Silas doesn't deal in vague promises. I'd rather tell you exactly what this does and exactly what it doesn't, than have you trust something halfway and get burned by it later. Activated charcoal is excellent at removing chlorine and chloramine, the chemicals your municipal water treatment plant adds to kill bacteria, and the same chemicals responsible for that swimming pool taste and smell coming out of your tap. It's also very effective against volatile organic compounds, or VOCs, things like benzene and trihalomethanes, which are byproducts formed when chlorine reacts with organic matter in the water supply. And it does meaningful work pulling out certain heavy metals, particularly lead and copper, along with pesticide residues like atrazine and herbicide runoff that washes into groundwater from nearby farmland. Now, one thing worth knowing, and this has gotten a lot of attention in the last few years, activated charcoal does show meaningful effectiveness against PFAS, those so-called forever chemicals you've been hearing about on the news. PFAS and PFOA, the kind that have turned up in municipal supplies near industrial sites and military bases, do adsorb onto activated carbon, particularly the higher-grade varieties. Standard charcoal filters aren't a perfect solution for heavy PFAS contamination, and specialized high-performance carbons do the job better. But it's worth knowing that the same material sitting in your gravity crock is part of the conversation around emerging contaminants that the EPA is still working through. It also does something people don't expect. It dramatically improves taste and clarity by trapping the organic compounds responsible for musty, earthy, or sulfur smells, what water treatment professionals call taste and odor compounds. Things like geosmin and MIB, the same chemicals that make pond water smell like pond water, and, well, water sometimes smell like rotten eggs after a wet spring. This is essentially the same filtration mechanism that earns commercial filters their NSF 42 certification for taste and odor reduction, and NSF 53 for health-related contaminant reduction. The two most common standards you'll see on a box at the hardware store. Your clay crock and your bag of granular carbon are doing that same certified work, minus the plastic housing and the certification sticker. Now here's where I have to be honest with you, because I've seen other channels promise charcoal filtration will purify water for survival situations. Full stop. And that is not responsible information, and people have gotten sick trusting it. Charcoal, activated or otherwise, does not reliably remove biological pathogens. It will not reliably kill or remove bacteria like E. coli, viruses like norovirus, or protozoan cysts like Giardia and cryptosporidium, the kind that come from animal waste working its way into a stream. It also does very little against fluoride, nitrates, arsenic, or dissolved salts, which pass right through the pores that trap everything else. If your water source is a creek, a pond, or anything you're not certain is biologically safe, charcoal filtration is a second step after boiling or proper disinfection, never a replacement for it. I'll say that again because it matters. Charcoal makes water taste clean and removes a specific category of chemical contaminants. It does not make untreated surface water safe to drink on its own. That honesty is exactly why this method has lasted as long as it has in Amish households. Nobody who depends on a well for survival, generation after generation, is interested in a method that only sounds good on the first try. They're interested in a method that's been tested against actual sickness and actual seasons and actual hard winters. And charcoal earned its place doing one job well rather than promising to do every job and quietly failing at most of them. It also matters what your water source actually is, because that changes what you're asking the charcoal to do. If you're on a municipal supply, your main concern is chlorine taste, trace VOCs, and whatever's leached out of old pipes on the way to your tap, and a simple charcoal pass handles that beautifully. If you're on a private well, you're dealing with a different set of problems. Mineral content, occasional iron or sulfur smell, sometimes agricultural runoff depending on what's planted near you, and charcoal earns its keep there too. But if you're catching rainwater or pulling from a creek or pond, you're in an entirely different category, and that's where I need you to go back and listen to what I said about pathogens, because that's the water that can actually make you sick in a way charcoal alone won't catch. There are two ways to build this homemade water filter, depending on what you've got and what you're trying to solve. The first is the traditional crock filter, the one closest to what's been used in Amish kitchens for 200 years. You'll need a large clay crock or a food-grade 5-gallon bucket, a layer of coarse gravel about 2 inches deep on the bottom to keep everything above it from clogging the outlet, a layer of coarse sand on top of that about 3 inches deep, and then your charcoal layer, crushed hardwood. Charcoal or activated charcoal, broken into pieces roughly the size of a pea, 4 to 6 inches deep. Cap it with a final thin layer of fine sand to act as a polishing layer that catches any charcoal dust working its way up before it reaches your cup. Drill or punch a small hole near the bottom of the bucket, fit it with a spigot or even just a piece of cloth-wrapped tubing, and you've got gravity doing the work. Water goes in the top, percolates down through sand, then charcoal, then gravel, and comes out the bottom clearer and better tasting than it went in. The second method is faster if you want activated charcoal specifically rather than plain hardwood charcoal, and it's the one I'd point a beginner toward first. You can buy granular activated carbon. GAC is the term you'll see on the bag, relatively cheaply from aquarium supply stores or water treatment suppliers, often for under $10 for enough to last a household several months. You'll generally find two kinds on the shelf: coconut shell activated carbon and hardwood, or bituminous coal activated carbon. Coconut shell has a finer pore structure and tends to do better against chlorine taste and odor. It also typically carries a higher iodine number, which is the industry's standard measurement of how much adsorption capacity a carbon has. And a higher number means more surface sites available to trap contaminants. The hardwood and coal varieties run a slightly larger pore size and tend to do a bit more work on the larger organic molecules. Either one will serve a household fine, but if the bag gives you a choice, coconut shell is the one I'd reach for first. One other thing worth knowing, if you're dealing specifically with chloramine rather than plain chlorine, chloramine is harder to knock out because it doesn't release from water as readily. There's a specialized product called catalytic carbon, which is activated carbon that's been treated to actually break down chloramine molecules, rather than just trapping them on the surface. It costs a little more, but if you're on a municipal supply that uses chloramine as its disinfectant, and many do now, catalytic carbon is worth knowing about. Back to building, fill a clean sock, a piece of muslin cloth, or a coffee filter with a few tablespoons of GAC, tie it off and suspend it in a pitcher of water for several hours. One thing worth understanding here is that contact time matters. The water treatment industry calls this empty bed contact time, or EBCT. The amount of time water spends in contact with the carbon bed, the longer the contact, the more adsorption happens. That's why a slow gravity drip through 4 inches of carbon outperforms a fast pour through the same amount. Give the water time to sit and stick. That's it. That's the same mechanism as the $40 cartridge, minus the plastic housing and the brand name stamped on the front. If you want to make your own activated charcoal rather than buying it, that's biochar territory, and it's a longer process, but it's the one that costs you almost nothing but time. You burn hardwood at high temperature with limited oxygen in a covered pit or a sealed barrel with a small vent, what old-timers called charring rather than burning, since the point is to drive off everything but the carbon skeleton of the wood without letting it turn fully to ash. Then you activate it by soaking it in a mild acidic solution, traditionally vinegar, for several hours, before rinsing it thoroughly and letting it dry completely. It takes a full day and some patience, and the smell will tell your neighbors exactly what you're up to. But it costs almost nothing beyond the wood itself, and it's exactly the kind of project that turns a backyard burn pile into a household's water supply for the better part of a year. Here's something the bottled water industry and the filter pitcher companies both benefit from you not knowing. Charcoal has a saturation point. Once every available pore on that charcoal's surface has trapped a contaminant molecule, it stops absorbing anything new. It doesn't turn the water bad, it just stops helping, quietly without telling you. For a basic gravity crock filter in regular household use, that's roughly 2 to 3 months before you want to replace or recharge the charcoal layer. For a sock and pitcher GAC filter used daily, closer to 4 to 6 weeks, simply because there's less charcoal doing more work per gallon. You'll know it's time before any test tells you, usually, because the chlorine smell and taste will start coming back through first. Since chlorine is one of the easier compounds to detect by nose, and one of the first things to slip past a saturated filter. That's your charcoal telling you it's full, the same way a full rain barrel tells you it's full by finally overflowing. And this is the part that should bother you a little. Those $40 refrigerator cartridges everyone buys are running the exact same charcoal, with the exact same saturation point, inside a sealed plastic housing designed so you can't see it happening and can't refill it yourself. You're not paying for better filtration. You're paying for not being allowed to open the box, for a company to decide when you're allowed to replace $4 worth of carbon, and for the convenience of never having to understand what's actually keeping your water clean. One more thing worth knowing before you build this, because it's the kind of detail that separates a filter that works for a season from one that works for years. Don't use charcoal that's been treated with lighter fluid, charcoal briquettes with binders and additives mixed in, or anything labeled instant light. Those products are pressed together with petroleum-based accelerants specifically so they catch fire faster at the grill, and that's the last thing you want leaching into your drinking water. What you want is plain lump hardwood charcoal, sometimes sold as natural charcoal or restaurant-grade charcoal, with nothing on the ingredient list but wood. If you're making your own biochar from a controlled char rather than buying charcoal at all, this problem disappears entirely, since you know exactly what went into the barrel and exactly what came out of it. That's actually the other reason this method has held on in households that take their water seriously. It's not just cheaper than a cartridge, it's more honest, because you can see every step of what you're drinking before it ever reaches your cup. My grandfather used to say that a man who understands how his water gets clean never has to wonder what he's drinking. And after 30 years of crocks and buckets and the occasional barrel of homemade biochar curing in the yard behind the smokehouse, I still think that's about the truest thing anyone's ever told me about self-sufficiency. The charcoal doesn't care what brand name gets stamped on the container around it. It does the same job sitting in a clay crock that it does sitting in a plastic cartridge, and now you know exactly why and exactly what it can and can't do for you. Take care of the water, and it'll take care of you.